Hello, Internet. What's up? This is Rowan Gray and Anish Ivu from Sunrise Debate. We're presenting our first episode of our new podcast where we're going to interview some fantastic debaters and talk to them about their success, various rounds, and the debate meta more generally.
So debating for 4 years from A&M Consolidated in public forum policy with coaching experience and circuit success with 3 gold bids and a 70% win rate senior year. Welcome, Mr. Small Schools neoliberal resistance leader, Srikar Satish. Nice to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So first today, we're going to talk about your semis round at Winston Churchill, which is a tournament you went on to win. This is a round which I think really shows it was super extraordinary and, interesting about your career. So
I guess let's talk about a little bit before the round. So going into the round, semis of a big tournament, did you have any sort of prep out or pre-round strategy going into the round?
We had a bit of a strategy. So for Churchill itself, the tournament, this was actually just after December ended. So Lars and I were finishing up college apps. So we finished our case in about like a day or so. So the one strategy we always had coming into rounds where we're reading framing is we just need to make sure we win the framing. And we just hit an Elkins team in quarters, actually. So we were expecting a lot of framing responses. So the strategy we had is I was just going to literally just dump a of responses and basically time suck whatever prep out they had. So we ended up flipping, for side of this round, and they flipped second. And that's basically the preparation. And obviously, one of our friends hit them earlier, so we had a general idea of what they're reading. So we had a general strat against it.
Oh, okay. So you flipped first, or you flipped neg. Gotcha.
Yeah, we flipped neg.
All right. So I guess we'll start off with case. I'm going to show a quick clip of the beginning of case.
A&M Consolidated negates. First is framework. Neoliberalism or hyper-capitalism is the notion that the free market should be used to solve all issues and that maintaining the free market is what policymakers are for. We believe this notion is dangerous and thus provide a topical framework. You should vote for the team who best advocates for resistance to the expansion of current neoliberal structures in America. Prefer for 2 reasons. First is a root cause. Neoliberalism encourages profit over people. Lamont 13 explains that neoliberal systems are largely weighted towards corporations and the wealthy rather than the common good. This shapes perceptions and behaviors, resulting in relationships that undermine care and reduce the understanding of freedom. Second, because of education. Hill 10 notes that neoconservative phases of education weaken opposition thought. The focus is on the production of a compliant citizen. Essentially, people are treated as a commodity in the current neoliberal system to gain profit from, rather than a fellow human being, which reduces the chance for societal progress. Sole contention is...
All right, so I guess let's talk about framing first. I guess the first question is, you introduced neoliberalism in a pretty Flay-friendly way, even with like the definition and everything. If this panel was maybe a more policy-oriented or more experienced panel, would you have introduced it in a different way? Or maybe if it was like a less experienced or a parent judge, would you have still introduced it in a way with more like definitions and maybe less warrants?
Yeah. Well, I'll answer the second part first. If this was a lesser experienced panel with like maybe more parent judges, we typically read different cases itself because even if like you can get them to understand like what the concept of neoliberalism is and understand how it works, they still have like a bias against the case, right? Because it's something they've just never heard before, which is why I think, especially when you have lesser experienced panels, just something that's just more people can resonate with, that's just commonly heard on the news is better. However, if we do have more experienced panels, we still typically do read like the same type of framing, because ultimately I think public forum is, even if you read very complicated arguments, it's supposed to be telling the arguments to the public, right? So if I came up here and I read like some critical pedagogy type stuff, right? Like Lars and I could have done something like that, but a lot of judges would be lost. And even if there are policy judges who might understand it, they might hack against it. So when we do go more tech, it's usually in like the rebuttal and stuff, because even in case, like this is like, I think a 670 word case or something like that, keeping it slow and just helping it understand means the judges are kind of not going to be biased against you.
Yeah, so it makes sense. Like you're converting things to do more public forum mindset. So how do you do that? Like other than just defining words and stuff like that, how do you specifically convert those like techie arguments you've learned from policy and turn them into like a way you can present to flays and lays and even, as you say, tech judges in PF?
Yeah. First, as you mentioned, you got to get rid of the jargon, right? So if I use like the word like drone pedagogies or something, and the Hill card, which is the second card, use that term a lot, right? You want to either bracket it out or like cut it in a way that doesn't use it, right? The other way is you could write a case, for example, that it follows like the case structure, like link, impact, alt, right? But most PF judges could be like, I'm not used to that. I'm used to uniqueness, link, impact. So even formatting the K in a way that makes sense with uniqueness, link, impact makes a lot more sense. And in the actual contention structure, like this is a very pseudo K argument, even the contention level. So formatting in a way that more people can resonate with definitely helps. And I think the most important thing, even if the case it isn't super Flay friendly, articulating it as very, very late in the back half, even if you have the most tech panel in the world, helps judges resonate with that. And even if they're like on the fence, not understanding it, it's the best way to get it, just in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I think it's I definitely agree that it's a lot probably easier to, or at least a lot more persuasive to read more of a soft left case as opposed to a more traditional K. Additionally, so let's talk more about the actual warrants for the framing. You didn't really include too much of a discourse voter or many other warrants people might include in their framing. Was it because of the panel, or was it just in general, you think these two are the most important?
A bit of both. This is, I guess, totally out the strat, but in some rounds, the second warrant from Hill, we might add a second card, which is the Connolly 08 card that talks about like how discourse itself can help break down these barriers, right? So we might just blow up on the second warrant and be like, that's a discourse voter, which we didn't in this round, right? But maybe if the panel was like former LD debaters, policy debaters, we might have done something like that. But the reason, like you said, we don't typically read like discourse voters in case we get a panel, like the case can be flexible, because Lars and I, we don't really like to change up case like a ton between rounds. It's just easy to keep it consistent for extensions and stuff like that. If we change up strats, that usually is like different extensions in the back half, or just different cards read in rebuttal to add on to case typically.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense. So I guess let's talk about the specific warrants that you chose to use. So the first was the root cause one. I think the thing that's probably the most notable here is that in PF, maybe other than a couple rounds or a couple of specific topics, people generally don't really make too many root cause claims, especially with something like neoliberalism. Most teams probably understand it as some version of a prerequisite. So how would a root cause claim be more effective in weighing than a prerequisite, in your opinion, or in the way you would employ it with neoliberalism?
Yeah, so I think a prerequisite, typically my understanding of debate, is like, in order to solve for some impact, you have to do this first, right? Root cause, I think, is more like the reason why things continue to occur is something else, right? And especially when you're reading pseudo-K arguments, soft left arguments, anything, if you could figure out the reason why things occur, and if that reason isn't solved, right, the problem will keep occurring no matter what. And in this round, especially, like, we read neoliberalism as a root cause for war on terror, MIC, and stuff like that, right? So even if they did win like their entire terror advantage, if we won that neoliberalism is a root cause of this, it's just going to continue no matter what happens. So even if you don't win a link of your case, it's at least terminal defense on their case, which means you could extend it as A, weighing on your case, or B, worst case, it's TD.
Got it. So yeah, I think it was pretty effective in this round. I think probably in general rounds to make these sort of root cause claims, especially with the soft left AF. But also the next warrant you read is an education one. So I think this one might be a little bit confusing for, I think, people watching or maybe even judges. So with your education warrant, are you advocating for a better form education, or are you changing how education works? Is it a pre-fiat or post-fiat voter, or both? If you can answer this one at a time.
Yeah, so it could be anything. Like the second warrant is meant to be kind of vague so that we can elaborate on the back half if we go for it. So it could be a pre-fiat reason why you prefer a post-fiat argument, which I know most of my policy debaters probably cringe at that, right? But it could be like education, like challenging neoliberalism gains the most educational value in the debate, which is why it's an impact filter for why you prefer neoliberalism, for example. Or it could be like, and what the card says is like, neoconservative thoughts have crowded out our education sphere, which means that our own discourse in the round of fighting neoliberalism is enough for a ballot, right? So it could be a pre-fiat voter. It could be a pre-fiat reason to prefer a post-fiat voter. Or worst case, it could just come down to, because this happened earlier in this tournament where someone read like some theory argument on us, it can allow us to access that theory weighing itself and be like, we have like structural fairness. Sorry, we have structural fairness, they have procedural fairness, and then you could do that sort of weighing.
Yeah, so it sounds like you can go for this K in like a whole bunch of different ways depending on how the round pans out. That's a very volatile argument. It's pretty smart. So the next question we had was, what are the best responses you heard to this framing? Not just at like this tournament, but in general, when you've read neoliberalism or soft left type framing, what are the best responses people make?
Yeah. So one of the best responses came in our Florida Blue Key Dubs round versus DuPont Manual. I'm sure Phil might have heard about the round. They came up as they read about like 3 or 4 minutes of cruel optimism, which essentially, from my understanding of it, is like your attempt to boil everything down to like one root cause, right? Causes other structures to just be like forgotten about, and those structures are just going to get worse and worse and worse. That like essentially means if they won defense on our framework, it's just basically going to mean that the entire framework gets turned on like a higher scope. That was one of the best responses we heard. Obviously, we read some responses to that, like the chance of progress is enough. There's many ways you can respond to it. Another response was actually at Delta Camp from, I forget who read it. A straight K versus this AF is probably the best way. You could concede the framework and just be like, we're challenging neoliberalism, but instead of the soft left manner, we're doing a hard left manner, which is rejecting the state as a whole, right? And also in the Florida Blue Key round robin, I think it was Park City, they read a card talked about like why challenging neoliberalism within the law will fail, right? I think, and this is some missed opportunities, you could also just argue that this framework is like the most abusive thing ever, right? Because how does the AF access neoliberalism? If we're telling, like on this topic, maybe not much, but for example, the Medicare for All topic, we said rejecting neoliberalism, right? If it's true that the neg is neoliberal, the status quo is neoliberal, it's impossible to challenge that, right? If you're neg. I feel like that would have been a very good response to the framework as well.
Yeah, definitely a lot of pretty good responses that could be made. And maybe I think maybe it's a bit hard in PF when people are still getting used to these soft left AFs, but yeah, I think definitely those are a lot of like really good responses, especially like cruel optimism, and even a hard left AF would also probably be really strategic against a soft left AF. So I think outside of the framing, let's talk about case for a little.
Breaking down a system. In the status quo, Lent 20 notes the coronavirus is revealing the structural faults of a system. As it destabilizes, expect others to tumble down in tandem and cascade. Like a crucible, it has the potential to melt down the current neoliberal structures that exist and reshape them. However, affirming would cement neoliberalism in a few ways. In 3.
All right. So I think pretty quickly before we get into your 3 links and your impacts and such, I think it's important we talk about the uniqueness at the top. So you talk about COVID and it would decrease neoliberalism. Have teams or would teams really challenge this uniqueness and say neoliberalism would be increasing? And if they were to win, neoliberalism is increasing, would that like completely derail your strategies, or how important is this uniqueness claim to your case?
In this specific case, it was extremely important because the case basically goes that neoliberalism is collapsing right now, but affirming gives it a lifeline, right? So if you could prove that neoliberalism isn't collapsing right now, or if it's increasing right now, converse, if anything, it just is terminal defense in the entire case. So that was like the one thing we were prepping out. And actually in that video clip, I was actually cutting a piece of evidence if they would have came up and did something. So there was, I think this was at Emory the weekend after. I want to say it's Lambert. I don't remember who it is. They read evidence about why neoliberalism is increasing now, right? Talking about like business stuff. And I feel like the way we responded to that is, one, we had like super recent evidence that we could read in Frontline, talking specific with like Joe Biden policies and stuff like that. But also, secondly, if people made that warrant and like uniqueness overwhelms, right? We would either go for it as like, okay, even if uniqueness overwhelms, right? There's still a net increase in neoliberalism in your world. So we'd still get office into the framework. At that point, the framework debate is super important, right? Or if it's a super tech judge, we'd be like, cool, even if neoliberalism is increasing right now, we have to challenge the discourse, go for the discourse. And we made our cases in a way that no matter what response you could go, we can collapse on our case in very different ways. And I feel like, especially when you're bringing policy-esque arguments to PF, you need to have like the flexibility of your case to collapse on it in like whatever way you wish.
Yeah, I think especially with the use of, I think the Hill evidence or any other evidence, I think in this round, maybe the education voter, but I think that's definitely pretty accurate. I think a lot of teams, when they read soft left apps, they might have a too technical or not technical enough framing or warrant, and then they either over or underutilize it, and that can really play a big part. So definitely adapting the framing warrants is super advantageous. And also, I think the other thing you mentioned, realizing that even if you lose the uniqueness claim, there's still some chances you could still probably recover from it, depending on the round. But you could probably still say there'd be a net increase in neoliberalism, or as you said, discourse voter, etc.
And that's just a really good mark. It's a mark of a really well-written app. If you can lose your uniqueness and still win the round, that's a really good case, right? So I think even broader than soft left apps, this is just a great lesson on case writing. Like if you can lose a major part of your case and still win the round on your case, that's a really good case.
Yeah. So I think let's go into a little bit about the links you chose to read.
3 ways specifically. The first is through business fill-in. Right now, Waters 15 writes that tech companies eager to repair the reputation with consumers have embraced technology to prevent spying by governments. However, when the NSA has to take a step back, businesses will see it as a sign of relinquished control. Hayden 11 finds that past precedent proves that when the NSA has to take a step back, the private sector surges to fill the void. They have an incentive to collect data to a far greater extent because they have a profit incentive. Sadly, a resurging business activity in the surveillance sector will only cement the current system of neoliberalism. The second link is through encryption. Encryption is the process of protecting information by hiding it in secret code. Right now, Dr. Raw 14 notes that the Snowden leaks have changed the conversation about privacy and security. American users are now taking measures to make their computers more secure. However, Greenwald 14 notes that even if NSA surveillance was limited, the US intelligence community with no limits and no oversight easily co-opt the entire reform process, changing nothing. They can trick millions of users into believing that their communications are now safe. This false sense of security would destroy the need for data encryption in the minds of citizens. This is harmful, as Nightingale 16 finds that data encryption is a focal point for a concerted and focused resistance against the mass use of technologies to know everything about everyone, and a vital path to reverse current trends back to humanistic approaches away from neoliberal. Encryption stops people from having their data stolen and being a cog of the neoliberal machine. The third is through...
So I guess let's talk about the first two for a second. So I think the first one about business fill-in, this was, also read on this topic is sort of a defensive argument. You could probably read it as a circumvention warrant, and for anyone who didn't debate the topic, you could essentially say the businesses would fill in for the NSA. So even if you affirm the resolution, got rid of the NSA, there would still be some businesses there. Was that sort of a recently choice argument, or for any potential defensive implications, or not really?
Yeah, that was one of the reasons we did choose to read the argument. Because this was the first, well, minus Blake, obviously, this was the first real tournament on the topic in January. So we obviously didn't have a very huge block file. One of our friends sent us a few responses before this tournament, but our hope was we would just win this warrant and we'd say this also acts as TD on their case. In this particular round, I don't think we went for this warrant. And in future tournaments, actually, we replaced it with a state phobia warrant instead. But that was one of the reasons we chose to read business fill-in for sure.
Right. And I think, Rowan, you had a question about encryption.
Yeah, so on encryption, it's a really unique argument. Honestly, I really love it. But did people have responses about how you could use encryption as a tool for neoliberalism or as a tool for capitalism generally?
Personally, I didn't see any cards like that, and I don't think anyone responded to that in a particular way. I think the problem when I see most people respond to this case at PF is they tend to get into this mindset, I need a block to respond to something. I need a piece of evidence. And they are very scared to read an analytic if they don't have evidence for it. And honestly, the way PF is going, I don't think you really need evidence for everything you're arguing, right? If you come up and you make a claim analytically, it should be enough to win a round. But a lot of PFers, at least in the case we hit this, when they don't really have responses to the case, they end up just going up and just reading a bunch of diss ads. They see the word encryption and they just be like, encryption is good, 10 reasons, right? And we'll come up and be like, well, the framing means the root cause, right? And we'll just extend away. So we didn't really hear encryption as a tool for capitalism in many rounds, but if we'd have heard it, we would have argued that that's kind of the point, right? Encryption being bad is encryption allows you to hide your data, right? Even if it's used to help businesses hide their data, you hiding your data is probably going to net outweigh. And that was the second card about why it links to neoliberalism.
I see. I definitely would agree about the underutilization of analytics, especially when dealing with a little more maybe not so common or not so stock arguments, especially in the case of neoliberalism when it's an impact that you don't really know. So I think, yeah, I think it's definitely something a lot of PFers really need to work on. I think, so the next argument, we don't have to play the clip, but the next argument is basically data localization. For anyone who didn't know or didn't read or didn't debate the topic, it's essentially that NSA surveillance means countries start localizing their internet and their cloud computing within their own country because they don't want to be spied on. So when you read the argument, this argument was also read a lot by like sort of the AF teams who say localization is a bad thing because it's like slows down the internet and stuff. And in your case, you said it was localization was a good thing because people could protect their own internet and it would be in their own areas. So I guess my question would be, if you, I mean, I presume a lot of people would have read sort of a localization bad impact turn on this argument. Was there a way you dealt with this?
Yeah, in a lot of the rounds, right, when you have two impact turns, you just have to see which one outweighs typically.
Right.
So we typically would be like, look, we'd go on the framing debate. We'd be like, if we win the framing, right, the impact turn gets taken care of because we prove that neoliberalism is worse than whatever you're arguing for, which would be like economic purposes. And in some cases, people might be like, oh no, localization is actually really, really bad for the economy, right? And we'd come up with like, cool, that's really good because it's bad for the economy. It means multinational businesses can't go in. That links back to the framing, right? So we dealt with it in maybe both those ways.
Got it. So let's go to the impact.
The impact is a sustained neoliberal
All right.
environmental disaster. Adaman 12 writes the neoliberal policies that brought ecological devastation and subject global climate into the economic logic and turned it into an object of strategic logic by commodifying it as a tool of profit and not one of a human right. Torah 16 explains that climate change caused the collapse of global ecosystems, economic uncertainty is one of the deeper causes of rising instability around the world. Action is key. Cohen on 9 explains that climate change kills 300,000 people per year and it leads to extinction. Ultimately, as Klein 17 notes, the window to lower emissions to avoid catastrophic warming is closing. What happens in the next years could determine the future of our planet and the human species, and thus we negate.
All right. So about this climate change impact. So a lot of teams, I think something that's probably really important here to note is a lot of teams who would read us off left off would, have their framing at the top or the bottom, and then read like links into the framing. So what was the strategic importance for you of having this neoliberalism bad impact? Was it to prevent any sort of like neolib good impact turns, or I guess what was the reason you had it there?
Yeah, one of the main reasons is in every round, debaters would come up and read util good, or like reasons why you should prefer extinction, for example. We could just come up and be like, neoliberalism is a root cause of extinction, that's framing. But judges really like that contextualized, so like climate change as well, right? So even at this point, basically is, let's say someone came up and they read a bunch of like diss ads on why are framing super bad, like for fairness or whatever, right? We would kick out of the framework and go for it in an extinction sort of way. And especially, I remember there was a round at Emory, somebody came up and read a bunch of reasons why our framing is bad, and we could have probably frontlined them, but we decided to concede it all and just go for it as like a util impact, for example. Also, I think if, especially in PF, like maybe in policy we should read framing and then we could read links into the framing. But in PF, if there's not like the impact is, a bunch of judges are like, what is this case? There isn't an impact, right? Even though it's clearly just the framework. So that's why we chose, even when we read this same type of framework, even if it's just the framing itself, we read like some sort of impact.
Did y'all ever actually go like specifically for the impacts on the framing, like just for those impacts, or would you always go for climate change as well?
Oh yeah, we'd go for the impacts on framing as well. Usually what we'd do is we'd use root cause to be like, weigh our case, right? It's also easy to prefer the framework. And then we go for like the case itself. There's a few rounds though for sure that we just went for the discourse voter off framing. And then we just be like, look, fiat theory, what matters is their discourse at the round. Hill wrote, this is the best form of discourse, stuff like that.
Yeah, that makes sense. So one thing I noticed when I was listening to this impact is that y'all don't ever like explain specifically how like tech companies link back to climate change, right? You just use this middleman word of like neoliberalism, right? The concept you're generally critiquing. So how specific do you think debaters need to be when they're linking their links back to their impact of their K?
Yeah, I think when you're linking it back in, you want to be fairly specific. The reason in this case we weren't specific is because the entire narrative of the case is that you give neoliberalism a lifeline. You allow for businesses as a whole to cut back in. So if you are reading a case that is specific tech companies, I think 100% on the impact level, you want to have something about tech companies. And of course, this was like one of the flaws of this case, which is what you're pointing out, is we didn't really have that specific impact evidence specific because we just talked about businesses as a whole, which is what we're critiquing, I guess, right? But in cases like, for example, let's say you're reading some Medicare for all, you want to talk about medical companies for sure.
Gotcha. So I think that's a lot about case. I think in general, if I think it was a really well constructed case, like the good framing words at the top, 3 links, an impact, uniqueness was there as well. I think it's really good example in general of one of the best soft left types of cases I've seen in PF. Rowan, if you had any thoughts about the case before we move on to rebuttal.
It was just overall just really excellent. I really like how there's so many different ways you can go for this case. You could collapse on this case 100 different ways. You could go for framing like 4 or 5 different ways. And so there's really no end of ways you can end this round. So that's strategic, not only because it's really, really hard to prep this case out, right? Because you have no idea what Srikar and Lars are going to stand up there in summary and wind up going for. So I think it's just really smart case design. So good on you.
Definitely very diverse collapse strat. All right. So I'm going to quickly show some of the clips from rebuttal, not all of it, but.
Let's implicate root cause specific to their case. Juro 14 notes that neoliberal totalitarianism feeds the excess of militarism, the military-industrial complex, getting democracy results in the justification of permanent endless war and structural violence. The reason why is that militarists are hooked into a market-driven logic that disdains about the social cost of despair they create. Their power serves as a corrupt form of casino capitalism that breeds the ideology and politics of the military-industrial complex. 2 reasons why this outweighs whatever link they give you. A, because their evidence about root cause isn't a root cause at all. It's complete trash. It says it racial profiling, but gives a ton of all causes. But also B, we give the reason why people go to the Middle East in the first place is like companies lobbying the government to go more into the Middle East. The proof is like Lockheed Martin. Proof is war on terror. Proof is like all these other issues that has happened. If that's said.
All right. So let's quickly talk about this. Well, it wasn't really an extension, but this sort of weighing or reframing. So you definitely read this root cause weighing that interacts like super well. Neoliberalism leads to like tech, not tech companies, but big arms companies like Lockheed Martin and going to the Middle East. So I think my question would be, if you already kind of knew what they were going to be running, or in general, you knew about their case, would it have been more strategic to not have a root cause claim in case and then just save the one for rebuttal? Or was there a reason you kind of had both? Or yeah.
I guess okay, sorry, like just rain started pouring down like crazy. But the reason why we chose to read it in case and in rebuttal as well is even in tech rounds, I think you need to like set up almost a narrative for your judge, right? If the judge hears this root cause coming from like the first speech, they're gonna be like, I've heard this a lot, and it's been developed even with more cards as it's been going, right? Versus somebody who just like reads a new framing in first rebuttal, right? They're gonna be like less likely to be like, okay. And maybe for something like Extinction First, which most people in PF have heard, they'll be more likely to buy it. But this framing is stuff that personally I haven't before, this year have heard into PF, right? I've seen obviously people like Hawken and people like read like that, right? But I haven't seen that much of this, which is why we still want to do it like at the very beginning. Also, a reason we don't just read it in rebuttal is the Lamoth evidence is really, really good. So even if they came up and been like, your like casino capitalism or like Giroux is like a bad piece of evidence, or if they had came up like, no, we're going for some random turn, right? The Lamoth evidence is general enough that we can just be like, okay, even we way over your turn still, right? And if I wanted to do that in a rebuttal, I would have to spend more time on it, which means less time for me to spend on their case, because debate is a game of time trade-offs ultimately.
Got it. I think it's pretty smart. And I think that, like you said, it's a pretty general card. It can be well applied. So I think this is something I might ask about a little bit later when we talk about Final Focus, but it does really start in rebuttal. It's about setting up a narrative that isn't just your case. It's about how your case interacts with your opponent's case. And do you think framing is I think the way you use framing, at least, is a really good tool for that, in that you can use framing as neoliberalism and talk about how your arguments and your arguments about neoliberalism shapes their own arguments as well. Have you found this to be like a persuasive tool you've utilized in the back half or with Flay judges? Is that something you like often do?
Yeah, for sure. I think reading a framework, forces all your links to feed into this general idea. And so basically in the idea of a lot of judges, if you win this idea that neoliberalism is bad or it's the worst thing in the round, right? They're just going to like, okay, you have the links to neoliberalism. It's just allows the judge to really only care about one part of the debate. And it's so many rounds we're just been like, you won framework debate, I didn't really care about the rest, right? But also it forces you to develop this idea, right? Like if you could come up and you could prove that neoliberalism explains why there is terrorism, if neoliberalism explains why the MIC goes to the Middle East, you set up this like idea where like neoliberalism explains basically everything. And so that probably means you want to resist that, right?
Yeah, so I'm looking at your framing that you read in case. So I think you kind of went for an explanation of the first one as your overview, right? Because your first warrant in case is about root cause. But you make it sound like it's a different warrant, right? Or yeah, you kind of make it sound like it's a different warrant. So is there a reason why you implicate it as like, oh, this is a new prereq on the idea of neoliberalism is bad, rather than saying extend our first warrant, it co-ops their case?
Yeah, the reason why is A, this card is a lot more specific to the MIC itself, but also B, like it's like what I say, and this sounds kind of weird, like as a debater, but you want to be able to spin cards in whatever way you like. The card actually says it, but you want to be able to spin it in a way that can take you out of stuff. So let's say they came up and they just read like 10 reasons why Lamothe is wrong. Then we could come up with like, cool, Giroux is still really good here, and we explain the warranting of Giroux. And even though the underlying warranting is that things become a tool for business gains, you become a commodity for those business gains, you can explain it in a way to take you out of like all those indicts.
Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. That's really strategic.
I think let's play the next clip, starting from here. Right. All right.
Let's go to the top of the half. On the uniqueness, their uniqueness evidence analyzes like 1994 to 2018. Our evidence is really good. Global Terrorism Index finds that terrorism is for about 5-year low. Clearly shows that NSA is working. But if the argument, clearly two implications. A, risk of solvency flows neg. But B, there might say terrorism is going to be increasing. Our evidence is specific to the deaths due to terrorism, which means have better. They talk about overloading. 3 reasons why that's gone. 1, Harris 13 finds that NSA has developed a Cumulo, which is a database that automates the analysis of terrorist suspects quickly and effectively finds data on suspects. You prefer this on recency. Srikar 20 finds the system is quick and effective today. 2nd, Rossman 16 finds the NSA has developed another program called Thin Thread, which does quick analysis of information and throws away searches that don't belong to what they're looking for. But 3rd, Vavra 19 finds the NSA is looking to new ways to use machine learning and AI to solve bad. This all outweighs A on recency because we have 2020 evidence that looks at they're not having the problem of B, but also B because we see like the risk of solvency. But secondly, you delink the link again. The Shackford 20 finds the NSA is looking into you delink it again because the real reason why there's an overload problem is because there used to be metadata, which is why all their evidence is from before the NSA ended metadata. What's actually happened? The NSA ended metadata, which means that none of it's all post-dated. But secondly, on the ProPublica evidence specifically, it's complete trash. Grander 14 finds that the real reason why drones work and how we're able to give data to drones is that we have geopolitical positioning, which means that we know exactly where the data is coming from. Their card basically says we can't tell where the data is coming from, which is why you have to add both, which is extra topical. But you know clearly where it is, which means we can just add domestic, which means that all the entire link is just gone.
All right. So I guess let's talk about a lot of the stuff you do there. There's a lot, but I think the first thing at the very top was you read counter uniqueness, something that's probably missing from a lot of PF rebuttals and something a lot of judges kind of get frustrated with. And also a good tool for the opponents to take advantage of if you don't properly do. So in this example, you read this, I think GTI evidence, Global Terrorism Index, and you basically said terrorism is not going the direction you're saying it's going. I think it's going down right now. So I think that was obviously very good. And you do a really good job talking about the methodologies and the year surveyed and a lot of evidence comparison. So do you think that PFers in general have a problem with poor evidence comparisons, and how do you think people should change that?
So I don't know if y'all know me very well, but I think PF evidence ethics are just garbage because everyone's paraphrasing things left, right, and center. I know Anish will disagree with that, but I think there's a real problem with PF. I think when it comes to a lot of I'm not gonna say that PF is a general, but a bunch of new juniors and senior and sophomore debaters, they'll come up and be like, we post date, and they'll move on, right? Not a real reason why that post date actually matters. Or they'll just not look at the evidence specifically, right? Like in uniqueness, even if the trend is going a certain way, the trend has to link specifically to your impact, right? So even if you just come up, in this case, for example, saying that terrorism is increasing and your impact to deaths due to terrorism, if the deaths due to terrorism is decreasing, it doesn't really matter, right? And I think a lot of what comes to PF is like your evidence is bad because it's paraphrased, or like our evidence is not paraphrased, or there's not real good evidence debates, like which methodology is better, or like why is this methodology better, right? Like I get also like our study uses a lot more data, right? But why does that data matter if the data is old, right? There's also a good example for, I don't know if I read this in this rebuttal. There was I think it was Shackford evidence talked about like 62% due to like drone bombings. That evidence actually analyzed like Operation Haywire, which is like the first time we ever used drones in the Middle East or something like that. Even talking about like knowing those historical backgrounds behind events helps you set up indicts like really well.
Oh, got you. Okay, yeah, that definitely makes a lot of sense. Right, especially in terms of like really making sure that you're ahead on the uniqueness picture, because a lot of times, even if there is evidence comparison, it's kind of becomes a moot point in the back half. Very rarely do teams ever, go for a warrant why a piece of evidence is better. So I think once you've maybe won the uniqueness picture, I think, well, this round, we're not going to show the cases, but they end up going for this like hidden link, or this link about Islamophobia. And they basically have a root cause claim about terrorism or Islamophobia being a root cause for terrorism. So let's say you win this unique picture about terrorism, and then they win their root cause claim about Islamophobia. Do you think that the question is, how important is the uniqueness in comparison to that root cause claim? So even if you win your uniqueness, does it really still matter if they have won a root cause claim?
So I think it is important. And I think that's how this round boiled down to. We went for this uniqueness picture about like why deaths due to terrorism is decreasing. So even if you win that the reason why things are occurring is because of Islamophobia, for example, right? If Islamophobia and the impacts from Islamophobia itself are becoming less and less of a problem, then we don't need to spend, for example, there's not an inherent reason we have to pass the plan or whatever, right? There's not an inherent reason we need to try and keep fixing that problem, right? We can move on to different issues if it's already decreasing, right? Also, if the root cause claim is true, right, that Islamophobia is the cause of these problems, and these problems are not occurring, right? That means that like the uniqueness picture itself it overwhelms the link, if that makes sense.
Gotcha. So I guess that probably really shows how important it is to win the uniqueness picture, which you pretty much do in this round. All right, Rowan, did you have any?
Yeah, it's really important. I'll just harp on that a little bit. It's really important to win the uniqueness picture. For example, there was one team against the the neg we read here. 4 minutes of the rebuttal, it was obviously a prep out. They just spent on that uniqueness evidence, why neoliberalism isn't decreasing, right? And that was the worst frontline we had to do, because we literally just kicked out a case at that point. Because if you win that uniqueness picture, you will probably win almost every single one of their links, unless debaters have actually prepped against that, which in this case we did, because we're just like, oh, we're still increasing, we fit under framework, right? But in just a normal case where people don't have these sorts of tricks to help them out on the flow, typically if you win the uniqueness picture, you're probably going to win the round as well.
Yeah, I definitely agree. There's so many rounds where people super underutilize how important uniqueness evidence can be. I know there's been so many rounds where I've just been able to kick out of turns by just using my uniqueness evidence. This is something you can think about too. If they try and turn your case and they don't counter your uniqueness, you can just make arguments why the uniqueness might be more important than the turn they try to read.
Yeah, so I think before we get to the next step, which was the final focus, and probably no speech after that, but I think something that I would like to ask is, do you think debaters and maybe camps and coaches, etc., should change the way that they do drills, or maybe include a drill about uniqueness and evidence comparison? A lot of drills might be about, things like analytical rebuttals, things like that. But would you sort of want debaters to be more practiced in comparing evidence or comparing uniqueness? Because I know people do like weighing debates and stuff, but rarely do teams just do uniqueness debates. That's something you would like to see implemented in camps and throughout coaching.
Yeah, 100%. And even when I coached my last year, I would tell my teams, win the uniqueness, win what the actors are doing right now, right? Because if you could win what the status quo looks like, you would probably win, which, uniqueness determines directionality of the link, right? You're going to determine which way the link is going to flow. And honestly, there's been some camps, I'm not going to, name drop camps, but some camps are doing a really good job of actually teaching people uniqueness pictures. And a lot of my students have been going to those camps, and there are some camps which I do agree with you that are underutilized, that picture. But I think a lot of first year outs, for example, like people my age and people who are maybe a year older than me, have understood like how important uniqueness is. And I think it'll be less of a problem. It's just, I think the problem with PF is people get this idea of I need to read straight offense, right? And so they underutilize uniqueness itself. It's like, oh, I'm going to not read a uniqueness response. I'm going to go for a turn. But the thing you have to realize is that if you read counter uniqueness and you read turns, that like them being like, okay, the world is going this way, doesn't mean that your turns aren't true, right? For example, in this case, if we win that terrorism is decreasing, it doesn't mean that the affirmative couldn't make it worse still, right?
Yeah, that's definitely a valid point as well.
Actually, have one more question. So is there any reason why you didn't? So in this rebuttal, you kind of read this overview of why neoliberalism prereqs like their impact that they're going for in the end, which I don't think we play the case, but their impact is like civil wars and like massive wars going on in the Middle East. Is there any reason why you didn't try and prereq their specific links and instead just went for the impact at the end?
Yeah, one is that would take a lot of prep, and especially as a small school, we don't have time to cut all those cards. But also two, it's like a form of efficiency. If I could just prereq the impact level, I don't have to spend time prerecting every single one of the link level. And obviously I got the few responses I read about like thin thread from Audrey Kell, very good team. But there's already weighing attached to all of these responses that I read. And I think it's really underrated about how much weighing and rebuttal can help you, right? Because even if I don't win this general picture of neoliberalism as like a prereq or root cause to whatever link you're going for, right? I'm still going to be winning some sort of weighing against your link, right? Which is still enough to, even if I lose the root cause weighing, the weighing that I read against your link, for example, later in the rebuttal, I read some sort of scope weighing. That's enough to win the link.
This round is very simple. Framing decides how you determine links. They have zero links to trying to end neoliberalism. They have just something saying like, oh, like terrorism is like bad. That has nothing to do with the framing. It's very simple. So let's get to the framing. You vote for the team who best resists neoliberal tendencies. Two reasons. A is the root cause. Moss tells you that people become a system of commodity for business gain. People are just devalued extensively and their lives are worthless. Why this matters comes through Giroux, who tells you that this is the reason why militarism exists, because we go for more profit motivations and people's lives are extended. That puts us into the Middle East. They just tell you no, terrorism's the reason why they do it. They completely ignore the warranty behind Giroux. Giroux talks about how you increase the amount of crises and how you increase the amount of violence in order to justify more military intervention. That's what the MIC does, and that's the reason where root cause is ultimately economic. But where we really win is the Hill evidence. Neoliberalism in this round has been conceded is the most educational framework in the round, which means that whoever has the best link to resisting neoliberalism is where you vote, because neoliberalism has just crowded out our education sphere. They say we're small, we have no clue. Crossfire, second, you shouldn't buy and use second summary responses. Now let's go to case. Oh, actually, real quick, don't buy their Jackson root cause evidence. It doesn't say anything about root cause. Now let's go to case. Let's extend the case because it's 100% conceded. What Lent tells you is right now the coronavirus is destroying the neoliberal rationalities because neoliberalism is just going to a spiral. The Overton window is blown left. We're going for a third. Fontaine tells you that the NSA domestic surveillance has ruined the U.S. reputation about globalizing data, which is why there's been more localization, such as in Europe. Mayhaus tells you this is really good because no longer companies get our data, people's data. They have to go through companies. Why this matters is because neoliberalism is an ecological devastation that's going to lead to extinction because climate change becomes a commodity. They say Elon Musk have times. It doesn't matter. We're resisting neoliberalism. No impacts matter in this round. Let's go to their case. On the top, they read you uniqueness about ISIS increasing. No, our evidence goes for all terrorism. You should just prefer ISIS. ISIS is just one terrorist group. We go for everything. But why it really matters is we're going for the drones argument. Our argument says that whatever NSA goes away, we no longer can use drone surveillance, which is why you have to be putting more troops on the ground. Why this matters because troops on the ground train terrorists, give the weapons, which is a prerequisite for terrorism in the first place. 100% conceded. Conceded arguments means judge intervention means that you have to vote for conceded arguments. And it's also it's a dissad that outweighs their case.
All right. So let's talk about at the top. I think we should talk about framing it first. So I think there's a big problem in PF, especially with the trend shifting towards more prerequisite weighing, where teams get in sort of prerequisite cycles. This is a little bit different because you're not reading straight prerequisites. You're reading root cause claims, and they're also sort of reading root cause claims. But I think sort of what a prerequisite cycle is I read a prerequisite to your case, i.e., without terror, there can be no encouragement to deploy troops. Without neoliberalism, there's no incentive to go into these areas at all without the military. And so both teams prereq each other. And this happened in other rounds where the most common one this year has been pandemics, right? The economy prevents pandemics. So it's a continual prerequisite cycle. So I think in general, my question would be, I know there's ways like time frame, etc., but what do you think is the best way to avoid a prerequisite cycle or sort of a circular piece of weighing that is irresolvable?
Yeah, the first way, which is what we did in this round, was to just compare the evidence, right? Our evidence is far better. The second way is to use empirical backings. So, for example, for pandemics versus economy, for example, you could talk about like how the U.S. is like the best economy in the world, and pandemics still screwed them, which means the economy isn't a fundamental prerequisite to pandemics, right? But also, you could talk generally when you get into these sort of prerequisite cycles, empirics, and also what I just said, you compare the evidence. But finally, you could also just like figure out like how long it takes, right? And I think you could time frame weigh your prerequisites, if that makes sense. So maybe the economy will stop pandemics for a very long period of time, right? Or like for a little bit of time, but that like as soon as the economy downturns, the economy goes up and down no matter what, right? So basically what I'm trying to say is that your time frame weighing means that it's time frame to your prerequisite as well, which means that my prerequisite should outweigh on time frame. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah, can you also use like other weighing that you brought up? Like, right, obviously the like prereqs aren't the only way to weigh economy versus pandemics or neoliberalism versus terrorism. So can you use other weighing you've used to kind of like add on to your prereqs?
Yeah, you can like meta weigh your prereq, if that makes sense, right? Like my prereq outweighs on time frame, or my prereq outweighs on magnitude, right? And I feel like APF doesn't allow for long enough times that when you get deep into that debate, you're going to already be up ahead when you do that sort of analysis to be like, this is the best prereq in the round.
Yeah, I think this is probably something we've seen from a lot of the most successful debaters on the circuit. I think as general trend, there's been a major trend in PF away from, sort of weighing as done on other events like magnitude, time frame, root cause, and towards its prerequisite, which is probably the shortest way you can sort of up layer your opponent's case. And so with more of a trend to prerequisites and more of a frequent occurrence of prerequisite cycles, hopefully we should see teams in the upcoming years learn to meta weigh their prerequisites and maybe focus their weighing on prerequisites and then focusing on meta weighing the prerequisites as a secondary concern. I think also in general, if you're not reading a framing, or even if you're reading framing, do you think that prerequisites should be the most ideal form of weighing in most rounds?
I personally think root cause is just really good. I read that through all of like high school, but I think generally prereq, short circuit, root cause, those types of weighings is a really easy way to up layer your opponent's case. And obviously, if you're reading a framework, maybe figure out why that's the most educational framework for the round. You up layer them even easier.
Gotcha. Yeah. So I think in general, everyone, people should just try to focus on meta weighing their prerequisites because it's something that isn't really seen. Yeah. So I guess let's talk about generally the extensions here and sort of the collapse strat. I think off the bat, let's talk about the case extension. Your third link I think was probably the one you were going to go for. I mean, it was the end of your case, but I think my question is, why did you extend the climate impact if you were going to like concede the impact difference or just say like the framing was the most important anyways? So yeah.
So the reason I extended climate really quickly at the end is they read some like usual stuff in summary. Obviously, this is the reason I spent, and there's some rounds where I think you don't need to spend the time on the framing debate. There's sometimes where you do need to spend a lot of time. And in this round specifically, I felt like whoever won the framing debate at this point, we're going to win the round because there was just so much time spent on this framing debate. So I didn't really like fully extend the impact level. Like I just be like, oh, that leads to extinction as well for climate change, right? It's not like full impact extension. There isn't an internal link there. The reason why is because I was just going to bite the D and just go. But you still want to mention that because let's say I don't mention that. And especially when you have a case like this where judges already are like, you policy boy, you get out of PF, go to policy, right? You want to just shut down any ways it gets squirreled because a judge could come up and be like, I don't think you access your climate impact. And even if they don't fully understand what the framing functions as, that's the way you can do it. I think specifically in this round, the extension like we talked about, it was obviously like the third link in our case, but usually, and especially on the NFU topic and in the TOC topic, we actually never went for a last link in case because I think it just becomes so predictable that people could just be like one response, time for 4 responses to the third link, right? And actually, that's what happened when someone prepped this out at, I want to say TFA. So sometimes having your second link be the link that you're most comfortable collapsing with could throw opponents off a lot. So they're like, you read 4 links or whatever, they're not going to go for the second link, they're going to go for the fourth one. So they're just going to read like 2 responses on each one, and the fourth one they'll read like 10, right? You just go for something super easy.
Yeah, I think that's definitely something we're probably going to start seeing because this year we've seen a lot more time sucks than previous years with teams 3-4 time sucks maybe. But I think as teams sort of realize like maybe we'll go bottom to top, or their main arguments at the bottom. You could just ask their previous opponents like what they go for. So I think switching up, maybe the time sets, pushing up your case, putting in different orders is definitely something that's a viable strategy. So I think my next question would be, I think let's talk about in general indite extensions in the back half. So this is a problem a lot of PFers have. So let's say they'll make an indite in rebuttal. They'll be like, this study is bad. It's selection bias, whatever other warrant. But in the back half, they say the study's bad, call for it. Do you think that you should extend the indicts and extend the warrants for the indicts to the back half, or sort of just rely on the judges to be like, call for the card and for them to read themselves? Probably at the benefit of having a little more time for other things.
Yeah. So first off, I think indicts that you're mentioning, what it talks about like author qualifications for studies, I think that's just weighing on whatever response you're going to read, a reason to prefer a response or counter uniqueness, not really like a real response, right? Because let's say the card is bad, right? There isn't a real reason that the entire link should be thrown out, right? But there's another type of indicts, which are the indicts I tend to read more often, which is like, this card is paraphrased garbage, right? It's just fake. If that's the case, right, I think it's completely okay for debaters to be like, look, the card is fake, to call for it, right? I don't need to explain how it's fake, right? But let's say it is an issue of like, we are comparing two pieces of evidence to figure out which evidence is the best, right? And it's about like data sets or something like that. I think it's much better for debaters to extend why it is the case. Because let's say you have a Flay or lay judge, like they might just forget why is there an evidence debate, right? So at that point, and especially Flay judges think the evidence debates are the stupidest things ever, right? So you need to come up and be like, this is the reason to support it. Be like, look, this is what our argument says. Remember, their evidence is only analyzing 1994 to 2006. Our evidence actually is analyzing recent data, which is why our evidence or our turn or disad, whatever, is the best, is what you prefer here, right?
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like making sure the indite extensions are there, even if it can get a bit lengthy. But I think in general, teams probably should practice maybe indicts a little bit more than they're doing so far. Because a lot of times, I think, especially depending on the topic, but on topics like NSA, where quality of evidence, and there's things that are sort of like sort of just facts that you have to compare, like how do drones get their data, or is terrorism going up or down right now? I think teams really do need to focus on indicts and that kind of thing a little bit more.
Just to take it back a little bit. So one of the things I saw straight off the bat when I'm looking at this final is that you start with framing, right? It's something you started every single speech with, and every single team I've hit running framing, and every time I've ran framing, I always start my final focus talking about framing, right? So you see a lot of teams starting their rounds with framing. It's pretty obvious why it's coded to that, right? Because if you win framing, you're going to win the round. Especially true this round, but true for a lot of rounds generally. So do you think it makes sense to do this with weighing too? Where sometimes if you win weighing in a round, you just win the round. So does it make sense sometimes to start the final focus or summary with weighing?
Yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense to start it off with weighing. Especially, I think at this point, final focus and summaries should also be very flexible, right? Let's say it's pretty obvious that you lost one of their contentions, or you're like needing time for your contention, right? Like let's say they read like 10 turns on whatever you need to go for, right? Obviously, maybe starting off with like a very lengthy weighing overview at the top might not be the best strat, because you need to get through, all the responses. But I think I generally do agree. In final focus, especially, you should basically be doing this comparison. Like this round comes between this argument, and this is why this argument wins, which is like the way, right? Especially in this final focus, right? What I actually did after this tournament, I reviewed all my recordings, and in this final focus, you can see that comparison is really missing. I'm going a lot quicker, using a lot of fillers, like I'm using a lot. So yeah. So basically, I'm looking here and figure out what is best. And honestly, people like know me as like this dude who can go up and spread like a million miles per hour. Like literally the next round of this tournament, I read like 369 words per minute or something crazy like that, right? Like doing that obviously is very good, right? And in some rounds, this strategic benefit. But honestly, slowing down for the final focus, making it really lay friendly, is what will win rounds more than whatever I just pulled.
Yeah, I definitely agree. Like, I think also, like you said, being like sort of flexible is pretty important. Like their case, your case, your case, their case. Maybe when you're first starting out, picking an order and just sticking with it. But I think as you do a little bit more debate, sort of switching it up depending on what you're winning. Like, let's say you're ahead on a dis ad that you really want to go for, or you're behind on case. Maybe you win the 2 dis ads and then your case or something like that. And you do also do this towards the end. You send this dis ad about like the drones dis ad and such. You do strength of link weighing. So I guess let's talk about that for a second. So with strength of link weighing, is it something that you think judges would buy a lot, or how advantageous do you think it is to as opposed to being like conceded dis ad or like 100% probability complete strength of link, you have to vote here? Do you think it's a valuable use of time to spend doing that kind of weighing?
Yeah, 100%. To use the words of John Nahas, when you concede an argument, you agree with it. And in debate, that's the easiest way for you to vote there, right? If there's an argument that you both agree upon, it's a concession, right? So I think, especially when it comes to judges, right? This is actually one of our Nats rounds, actually. If the round gets messy, the judge is going to look for just the clearest way to vote, right? So let's say hypothetically in this round, where the case debate got so messy and the framing debate got messy, the easiest place to vote is just this conceded dis ad. It's just an easy cop out to vote neg here, right? That's the reason we started doing the strength of link weighing, starting especially in January. But also, there was some other weighing attached to it. It's like, this is the reason why terrorism exists in the first place, right? I think it's important to know, even if you don't be like, here's a prereq, right? Even just wording what it is can be enough for judges. And I remember one of the ballots in this round specifically said like, they bought that prereq weighing and they voted off it, but we didn't explicitly articulate it as prereq weighing in fine, right? Gotcha. So just doing something like that is enough.
That makes a lot of sense. So one thing when I'm looking at this final, I see you're going for framing, you're going for your neoliberalism link, you're going for your climate change impact, and you're going for a DA on their case. And I also think you went for uniqueness. So that's 5 things in final. So obviously you're covering a lot. You went kind of fast in final, not like too terribly fast, but you went a little bit fast in final compared to a lot of other finals I've seen. So there are a lot of other debaters that don't go for even close to 5 things. So do you think that going for 5 things is strategic or not going for 5 things? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, I don't think going for a lot in Final Focus is strategic at all. And that's one of the biggest takeaways I got. And for any new debaters, the most important thing I think you should do is just record your speeches and look back at them, right? That's how you really improve. Like junior year, I improved a bit. Senior year, I improved a bit. But from December to TOC, I think I got the most improvement because I just listened back to my recordings. I'm like, if I was a judge, how would I like this, right? Especially in this round, though, what I think in my strategy in this round, obviously I don't remember because that was like 5 months ago, but what I remember was climate change didn't really matter, which is why I spent literally like 2 seconds on climate change, right? I felt the framing mattered a lot in this round, which is why I think I spent like 30 to 45 seconds on framing. It wasn't its own voter at this point, right? It's just a reason you prefer a case. So that's why like the weighing debate in this case is just missing, right? Because in some rounds, for example, Blake is a really good example. They'll spend most of their final focus on weighing, right? And when they win that weighing and they win their link, they'll win the round, right? So that's kind of our strat in this round. So obviously I had more time to extend stuff on their case because our link was fairly uncontested, except for the Elon Musk response at the very end, but which didn't really end up mattering. So the idea actually was I started off this final focus really quick. I have no idea why, but our strategy coming in was to read this and go for the dis ad. But I'm going on their case and I realized, well, I have like, 30 seconds here, right? So I'm like, I'll extend uniqueness evidence as well. And the reason why is, at least in policy, for your dis ads, you have the uniqueness, link, brink, internal link impact, right? So if I just did the dis ad, their uniqueness evidence could easily overwhelm the dis ad, right? So that's why I decided to extend the uniqueness evidence as well. So there is a lot of issues going on in this round, and the way I phrased it in this round was really atrocious, right? But in reality, there's the issue of neoliberalism, which is framing and link, right? And there's the issue of terrorism, which is just uniqueness to dis ad, right? So I think if I was being smart in this round, I should have just been like, look, this round comes down to terrorism, and this on neoliberalism. Framing's really easy. I probably shouldn't have even extended root cause. But like, even if they win root cause, education is an easy cop out for you. Should have extended the link. Be like, climate change doesn't really matter. Even if Elon Musk does, we have a risk of solvency. On their case, remember uniqueness. Remember dis ad. That's probably a much easier way to doing it, and especially when looking back at my old rounds and whenever I think looking back at sophomore debaters and junior debaters, they get so caught up in this line by line, right? Like, need to win this uniqueness extension, need to win this extension. But you can collapse that all into much of a better narrative. And that's ultimately what Final Focus is about. And sadly, I didn't discover that until like TOC and like, it's not even TOC, like TFA.
Right. So I think a couple maybe notable things here, and I think we're gonna review another final, which is from April, which you said was a lot happened, or a lot of reflection happened in between those. But I think in general, there is sort of a trade-off debaters are now having to realize when you're going into more of a technical, fast debating era. People would have your first final, the second summary covered 6, 7, 8 pieces of offense or whatever else. So they're kind of having to realize this trade-off between, on the one hand, you want to maintain a narrative, you want to make the judges understand everything, especially you want to be checking back against your own biases, because these are already arguments you have thought on your head, you've understood them pretty well. Judge might be hearing them for the first time, second time, so you want to be able to check back for those biases. So you want to explain things pretty thoroughly, but obviously you don't want to massively undercover something in the first final or make a strategic response in that way. So I think in general, do you have any advice to maintain efficiency? I think maybe one thing I'll quickly add on is something a lot of teams are just now starting to do, is when they're making their narrative, which is in a technical terms, it'd just be frontline, extending, wing, but making them all in one cohesive unit. So maybe frontlining while extending, or doing all of them in one like cohesive way, could probably be a way to save time, while also not trading off with that persuasive element. But yeah, do you have any advice for teams trying to find the balance between persuasiveness and technical ability?
Yeah, so the one thing in the extension of this final focus that was not as good was it was a lot more card based, right? Like I just like card. So there wasn't the actual narrative and like what the actual case talks about, and we almost lost a ballot here because of that. So what I suggest to debaters is, when you're going to do your extension, just explain your case like you're explaining it to you, right? For example, in this case, I'd be like, neoliberalism is on his death toll right now because capitalism has gone so far where it is overblown, right? But affirming and allowing, not Medicare for all, affirming and letting the NSA continue is really bad because it allows for them to get into international markets. That's the globalism link that talks about how I already forgot the link, how NSA causes people to globalize. And so that means, NSA causes people to open up their markets, but without the NSA to close it down. That's really bad because this gives neoliberalism a lifeline wherever the NSA exists. I don't even remember my case, to be honest. So if I'm just look at the case doc or whatever, right? So yeah, doing that allows it to continue, right? This is a much faster extension than what I gave as well, right? But it also makes a lot more sense. The next thing I'll say is what you said as well, right? A lot of your case implicitly frontlines, like whatever people were saying, like your spikes, your uniqueness evidence, or whatever. So when you extend your uniqueness evidence, right, you can just be like, this responds to blank, blank, and blank response as well, right? Because blah, blah, blah. And it is really underutilized, I think, in PF. People have this idea of like full extension, full front lines, right? But I think you implicitly frontlining is really good. And in this round, obviously, I didn't do a lot of that, but it's something that we started utilizing a lot this year specifically. We'd be like extending to like, this uniqueness evidence takes care of all their turns, or like whatever we extend the root cause, like the root cause evidence means that we weigh over all their turns, or something like that.
Yeah, I definitely agree, and I think we're gonna quickly look at a different final from, I believe, your TOC round 5 or a TOC prelim against Marissa W.
And I guess just to harp on everything so far, like we obviously read a very, very out there case for PF, right? Like you don't see PFers reading this, but obviously like we didn't have like the best competitive circuit. Like we weren't like, Bethesda who won like every single bid tournament with like some new meta or something like that, right? But I think it is very possible for people to read, even at the same tournament, we read like a Foucault AF, right? You could read very complex arguments if you break them down for judges, where like tech judges aren't just like bots where they're just gonna flow whatever, right? If you break it down and you put the effort to try and explain it to terms where people can understand, tech judges might actually vote for it.
This is one of the most experienced progressive debaters on the circuit telling you to use narrative. So start putting narrative in your cases.
Definitely.
This round is very simple. It comes down to whether U.S. imperialism or China imperialism is worse. It comes down to who controls that. First, they just say there's a lot of factors for a root cause. Doesn't matter, we're both impacted to imperialism, but we're saying the U.S. imperialism is uniquely worse. First, the Davis evidence is very specific. It tells you that countries in crisis right now are being caused because of the U.S., because the U.S. just goes, intervenes whatever it wants, and screws up countries. Iraq and a bunch of other places prove. Their card just says like, oh, militarism can't be put to a root cause. There's not really a warrant there, but also we give you a clear warranty from Davis. But if you don't buy that, and this is where we're really winning, is the Mazur evidence on the impact evidence. It tells you the reason why China and Russia are even expanding in the first place is because they're disenfranchised with U.S. imperialism, meaning that our argument is a prerequisite to theirs. Let's go to their next responses. They talk about, actually, you can extend the framework. You should vote for the team that best resists imperialism. I already told you why with the root cause. They talk about how China is like getting worse. They dropped the AP21 evidence. The round is over. The AP21 evidence tells you the U.S. is actually getting worse for human rights and worse for everything else because they're going more militaristic. However, China is going more and more better for human rights, which is why a Chinese-controlled world will be on net better than the U.S. Completely conceded, 100% probable. The round is over. But secondly, they say open imperialism is worse. Our argument says that international organizations work to check back China. No one checks back the U.S. However, the 100%, the only argument that's 100% conceded in this round is our third link, which means it's 100% probable. Judge intervention means you should vote here, but also two, it means you presume neg no matter what happens. Our link evidence is very clear. That tells you that you 50% increase. You basically use loans to bribe countries. 50% increase. That's really bad because they bribe them to allow the U.S. to intervene wherever they want. So the Ontario evidence, the only evidence in this round about the U.S. tells you the U.S. goes 59% more to war and 4 times increase to war, which increases the conflict and prereqs. This also outweighs because you control 100% of the international institutions compared to everything else. Also, all their cards about war aren't specific to the U.S. Our arguments about U.S. imperialism doesn't. Let's go to their C2. We are extending Zhao. China's having a collapse of the economy, legitimacy crisis, and environment, and that means that they can't expand. They say they're expanding now. Yeah, maybe they can be expanding now, but also that means in the long term they can't. They're not going to be able to, which is why it's been slowing down. BRI investments slow down. Also, this is a new summary frontline. Don't let them get away with this. You should probably not evaluate it. If anything, default neg if the round is too close. Because A, like we spoke first, but also B, neg is status quo.
I feel like a lot of times judges will be like, oh, I don't really know what was going on here, especially a lot of Flay judges just don't know what to do in a certain round. So do you think it's useful to sometimes tell them, if you don't know what you're doing, vote here?
Yeah, 100%. Say like especially I remember we had teams that did this and we did this all the time. We'd be like, look, this round has gone pretty close, but the one thing you know, and the only argument that's 100% conceded is this argument, right? Obviously, only do this if your argument's actually conceded. They'll be like, the 100% conceded argument. They have 3 responses, right? Like, you know that it isn't 100% conceded, right? But this is, for example, this link was conceded, and especially even if like the link is conceded, but they have impact D, right? Just blow it up as conceded because the judge would be like, wow, this is a conceded argument. I should probably vote here, right? Especially if there's just ink everywhere else, right? Because judges want to vote on what seems easy, and what seems easy typically is just conceded arguments.
Got it. Yeah, I think that's what a lot of teams do. Just like this conceded piece of this, like they choose an adjective for everything. Probably makes it somewhat more persuasive, especially if you use inflection and all of that good stuff. All right, so I think let's start at the very beginning of this final. This is probably the tactic used by some of the best debaters we've seen at TOC the last couple of years. Dalton this year, VIPBL the year before that. They showed up their final with this round is quite simple. It comes down to X or X, or it comes down to this or this. So when you're trying to organize the main debate, how would you do this when you have multiple layers to the debate? Like let's say you have framing, weighing, DAs, etc. How would you what do you think is a consistent way to be able to simplify the debate into like this versus this, or maybe a couple issues?
Yeah. So ideally, if you do your job correctly in summary and final focus, and you collapse down to like one case argument or like one dissent that you're going for, right? Ideally, it should come down to one argument you're going for versus 2 arguments you're going for. Obviously, there's multiple layers to the debate. Like, you might have a pre-fiat page, you might have a presumption page, whatever, right? If you have this, it could still come into like, look, like, for example, like this round is really simple, right? Does neoliberalism outweigh blah, 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 whatever impacts they go for, right? Or does imperialism outweigh whatever impacts they're going for, right? And you'd be like, we tell you blah, 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 and you get into your wing, right? I think it's really easy, especially in this round. Like, obviously, we're not going to show the actual round. I'm not going to tell you what happened in the round, but before this round, there was just ink flying everywhere, right? Because it was a very close round, and especially because this judge, like the judge was amazing, and I really like their RFD, but the judge didn't have a paradigm up on Taproom, so we had no idea what to believe with the judge, right? So we wanted to just make it as clear, because judges are just going to vote for whatever argument they think is clearest, right? So there's a strategy. You could be like, respond to this, respond to this, respond to this, respond to this, right? A lot of debaters do that, but I think just coming up be like, look, this debate's like really tiring. Here's what the 2 rounds come down to, right? This argument and this argument, right? The judge's like, okay, I'm gonna look whoever wins the arguments, right? Just makes it cleaner for the judge's mind.
Yeah.
I think it's a really strategic way of shaping narrative, right? Because obviously, you're sitting there, you know which arguments you're winning, which ones you're not. So if you're able to tell the judge how to look at the debate, you can tell them to look at the debate in a way that makes it look like you're winning a lot more than you actually are. So I think that's incredibly smart. And again, as Anish mentioned, all the debaters we've seen doing this are just so good. So I think it's something that comes when you're able to realize, how do I frame this debate in a way that makes me look really good and makes them look really bad? So be on the lookout for that. You can try it out.
Yeah, I think so. Something else, just past beyond making the round simple, which is a big part of narratives, but I think in general, the biggest issue of narrative in PF that a lot of teams don't understand is narrative is not just, repeating your own argument over and over again, but narrative is about how your arguments interact with both sides of the flow and how your narrative also means that you win their case. So this might be a lot harder and, maybe different topics, but I think this specific speech outlines it really well because you say that U.S. interventions mean China is forced to expand as well, so it's a prerequisite. And U.S. is being more militaristic, and China is being more pacifistic. And this sort of narrative you have about U.S. imperialism, like the big bad U.S. doing stuff, and they can do whatever they want, no one's going to stop them. So how would you like this tactic and this the way you employ this narrative? How do you think debaters should try to employ this in other rounds?
Yeah. So obviously this is a flow round, right? And even in lay rounds, I think the same strat can occur. How I think debaters should do it is, at least in Final Focus, I see a lot more content and less analysis, right? If we look at this final and we really take it to what is actually being argued, right? The framework level, Davis root cause, that's weighing, right? Next is like the Mazur evidence, which I used as a prerequisite, right? Like they're only expanding because of the US. Then is the AP evidence, which is 2 world comparison, right? Like without the US, like a world with China is better. Might be capped, but the evidence actually says that, right? So, there is that weighing, and then you get the actual case argument, the extension of case. Then you get weighing on the bottom because of scope, because of international institutions, right? There's no check back to U.S. People check back China all the time, and on their case, you get some time frame weighing, right? And you get the piece of defense. So what's actually being extended is 2 actual arguments, right? The argument about them using the IMF to bribe people to do whatever they want, and the argument about China cannot expand anymore, right? But then the rest of that is just completely just weighing, like 2 world comparison, right? And I think the way you employ and build good narratives of Final Focus is 2 world comparison, right? I know a bunch of boomer coaches will come up and be like, 2 world comparison. Your final should be like, this is what our world looks like, this is what their world looks like. But the reason they say that is because it works, right? If you could be like, here is a world with, for example, in this round, right? Here's what US imperialism looks like and why it's bad. Here's what China imperialism looks like and why it's not so bad, right? Same thing. Because especially in this round, right? Like, there was a lot of weight going on like the framing level, right? Like, oh, is China worse, US worse, whatever, right? Or like, is imperialism even the end goal, right? If you could just come up and be like, look, we go through arguing US versus, especially the coming topic about NATO, right? You could just be like, this is really down to what control is worse, Russia or the US, right? You can still do the exact same thing, just make rounds super simple.
Right. And I think the biggest distinction when you talk about 2 worlds comparisons, and I think the reason a lot of sort of more, modern age technical debaters sort of discount it is because a lot of teams who might do a 2 worlds comparison or something like that, they'd be more focused on like the impacts or, maybe a probability weighing. But I think the most important thing to learn not to do is just to like strawman your opponent's arguments. So when you were, explaining Chinese imperialism and stuff, you were talking about the actual warrants why Chinese imperialism is not true, and the actual warrants why or Chinese imperialism compared to like U.S. imperialism isn't as bad, or why it's U.S. imperialism is a prerequisite, etc. But you talked about like the actual warrants, the comparison, as opposed to just strawmanning it and be like China doesn't do anything. But you were like pretty truthful and pretty realistic in your warranting and everything, which makes, especially I think, and people talk about in Flay debates, you can strawman as much as you want and judges will vote for it. And the reason people don't employ this narrative tactic in tech debates is because they don't want to, seem like they're strawmanning. But I think what you did was that you didn't strawman. You made it like pretty clear, and you were pretty like truthful to how your narrative does interact with their argument, and you established this 2 worlds comparison in a truthful manner with no strawmanning. which is why this and a lot of other slower 2-0 comparison finals have been done really well. I think a pretty good example is Dalton from TOC semis of this year. But yeah.
Yeah. And I think the reason this works, and I'm gonna again quote, the great John Nahas one more time, right? Tech rebuttals, Flay summaries, lay final focus is will win rounds, right? And by lay final focus, it's just like a lot of people think weighing needs to be treated as its own response, right? Like weighing needs to be taking out of their case. But weighing could simply be like, look, if they win their entire case, here's why it's not so bad, right? They'll be like, that's not offense. Why do I need to extend it in final, right? Finals shouldn't just be offense. It should also be the comparison between your 2 points, your 2 impacts, whatever, right?
Right. I think, yeah, I think, another thing just to quickly add on here is, it's about terminal defense. So I think let's probably talk about that for a little bit. You're definitely right though, that you do want to, have more of a layer final focus in general, make it pretty simple. But I think something else to consider is it also kind of depends on how the round is going for you. And that should shape, your decisions about your narrative, etc. So for example, I think in this round, you may have been ahead on, or slightly ahead on a piece of terminal defense, or I guess let's say in general, you were ahead on a piece of terminal defense. Should you try to really prioritize that piece of defense, or maybe send 1-2 other pieces of defense, add presumption warrants, or how do you think you should leverage terminal defense? Like if you're ahead on terminal defense, what do you do going into final focus?
Yeah. So terminal defense, defense only becomes terminal when it's implicated as such, right? Like I could read a piece of defense, the exact same response, be like, China is not expanding, right? But if I'm not implicating this as, thus they cannot do imperialism, or they don't have enough resources to continue it in the future, right? It's not terminal itself. So I think if you're far ahead on a piece of defense and it's implicated to just take out their case, right? Spend more time on that, because ultimately, and I see this all the time when I'm coaching, or to anybody who asks me, debate is a game of time trade-offs. The more time you spend on an argument, the more likely the judge is going to buy the argument. But that means that you're undercovering a different part of an argument, right? So I completely agree with you, right? Like if you have, let's say you're ahead on 3 pieces of terminal defense. Some teams will be like, 3 reasons why you don't buy them, first, second, and third. And then you do some sort of weighing at the end that does all of them, right? That's fine. But I think especially in rounds where maybe you have to backline a piece of defense you read, right? Just going for something you're clearly ahead and just spending time on why that means their entire case is gone. It's just much easier.
Right. I think it's probably really important. And also, a lot of teams don't exactly know what terminal defense is. So I think probably a decent way to explain it is a mitigatory response is something that even if it's true, your opponents, they still have somewhat of their impact happen. Terminal defense means that if that statement is true, there is no chance, no matter what, their argument will happen. So, in this speech, you're like, China is, they're lacking legitimacy. They physically cannot be imperialistic. In the Russia topic, we might see this played as NATO physically cannot move enough troops there, or Russia physically cannot, go here for whatever reason, they're out of oil or whatever other reason you might have. So I think it is probably important for teams to be able to realize what is terminal defense and I guess understand the importance of it, because I think, like you mentioned, winning terminal defense can really be round ending.
Yep. And I think one of the biggest errors that I see when I watch novice rounds, watch rounds from kids on my team, is what they'll do is they'll extend defense, right? But then they don't implicate it as terminal defense, right? They might say this is very important or whatnot, but if you extend it as terminal defense and you win that it's terminal defense, the round essentially ends because I can't vote on their case. So in some rounds, it can just be a simple one sentence, like this is why this defense takes out their whole case. But if you don't have that in there, then I can't vote on the defense. So I think implicating things is one thing that turns someone from a decent debater to a good debater and turns a good debater into a great debater. So that's something to look out for in your speeches.
100%. And you'll get a lot of, I forget which camp teaches this, honestly, but then there's a lot of people who just come up for every single thing in Final Focus, be like, why does this matter, right? And they'll give you a line. It sounds really corny, and it might, take a little time out of your speech, right? But that's enough to make sure that every single response you read is implicated. And I'll do drills with my kids where, I'll tell them, after every single thing you say in Final Focus, be like, why does this matter? And give me a line, right? Like, this matters because blah, blah, blah.
All right. So I think wrapping up, I think we talked about this a little briefly, but you said, you look back at all of your recordings and we talk about improving. And that's probably why a lot of people would be watching. They want to, improve. Everyone can always improve in debate. But from improving from one debate to the other and recording yourself and going back and watching the debates and analyzing the rounds. So I guess my question would be, were there any questions that you asked yourself, or is there any particular way you like to analyze rounds? I know for me personally, I like to do transcriptions. So I like to, type out my speeches and see where my inefficiencies were. But I guess for you, what were the sort of questions you were asking yourself when you were analyzing the rounds?
Yeah, transcriptions, I love doing them as well. And I think it's an amazing efficiency drill. Other things I'll do is like, is there a different collapse strat I can do, right? The one thing I think PFers are stuck into is collapsing on their case, right? So what I'll do is like after our rebuttal, I'll be like, okay, or like after second rebuttal, first summary, whatever. I'll be like, is there a different collapse we could have done that could have made this round easier, right? Maybe it's not even our case, and maybe there might be a different round. Other things which I think is really important when you watch back rounds, because you'll get the RFD from your judge, right? So you'll know whatever lens the judge is viewing the rounds in. Even if you completely disagree with it, you could figure out what the lens is. And then you could be like, how can I adapt this speech more for the judge? And especially if you look at the first round from Churchill, right? We had a lot of very technical judges there, but especially in early December and like more like late December at Isidore Newman, we got a lot of judges who didn't really resonate with their arguments as much. And we thought like, wow, these are judge screws, right? When we look back at the RFDs and we look at the rounds themselves, we're like, okay, if I'm looking to a world where maybe I prefer this argument more, I need to do more warrant analysis between this argument and this argument. And that really tells you like where I need to prioritize my time in the back half, because the back half is all about time trade-offs, right? If there's a judge who's like clearly liking this argument more, that means I need to spend more time doing warrant analysis, or more time doing impact weighing, or more time just doing case extensions if judges didn't understand the case extension, right?
Right. I think something for me that definitely helped was, I think, giving it a little bit of time before you go back in your recordings. Because if you watch the round right after you do it, you're like, oh, I definitely won that. But if you maybe give it like a couple days after the tournament and it wasn't like the round just happened, and then you sort of look back at the RFDs and you aren't really in the mix of the round. And like I said before, like debaters having preconceived biases, because they know their own arguments, they know everything that they wanted to say. But I think giving it some time and sort of understanding the preconceived biases the judges may have had, and other things like that, definitely, like you said, very helpful.
There's one more thing I almost forgot to mention. Something that's also really important, and people underrate this, right? For our first 3 years, it was just Lars and I, in case you didn't know. So there's nobody else who kind of knew what PF was, that was just watching every round and like out rounds were and be like, hey, can you explain this to me? And so we never actually had to teach people PF until like last year. And last year we'd have our novice team, like really amazing team, by the way. They would watch all our rounds and they'd be like, hey, I didn't really understand this. And that gives you a red flag, right? If your novice team who already knows enough about PF to be able to flow rounds doesn't understand how you're implicating an argument, it means you didn't do it well enough, right? And so you should show your round recordings to your novice team. And if you don't have a novice team, maybe show it to other members of the community who know about PF, even if preferably if they know less than you about PF, because if they know more than you, they're going to analyze it in a million different ways. If they know less than you, actually, you can be like, this is why, I didn't understand this argument. Obviously, to do more than you, it's even better because they could tell you, strategic stuff, but specific stuff to adaptation and how you portray arguments in the back half. I think looking to novice teams are actually really important.
Yeah, that's actually sounds like a really great idea. I'll probably have to try that out at some point. Sorry, my novice teams. So the last question we had. So when I hear the name Srikar, first thing that pops into my head is framing, right? Because that's something you've become incredibly good at. It's something that very few PFers really do a lot. And so that's kind of the word I associate with your name. So I know you've worked a lot to making your framework more interactive, make your framework make more sense within the confines of debate. So how have you really done this over like between the Winston Churchill round we saw and the Marist round we saw? How have you evolved in terms of how you present framework?
Yeah. So actually, we go before Winston Churchill to actually 1 year before Winston Churchill. That's when we started playing around with. Actually, no, that's even half. The UNCLOS topic, I don't know if y'all debated that. That was my sophomore year, I want to say 2018 to 2019 topic. No, it was 2017 to 2018. I want to think. I don't remember. September topic then. We read a soft left af about macaw whaling. That went pretty well because many people didn't know how to respond to structural violence. It was that case is atrocious, obviously, now that I look back at it. But the way it's evolved, I think, and it's just the amount of judges in PF as well, right? Back then, most of the judges are like people, the framework like the big framework team, the team who read a framework back then was Alan Abbott at TOC. So that's the framework that most people would understand, right? If I came up and I read for something like neoliberalism, right? Most judges wouldn't understand that. But also the way we've evolved framework in that time, right? We really got framework down at the beginning of this year because we would make it too technical or we make it not technical enough, right? So we read a framework at Winston Churchill actually the year before. We downed quarters, but that framework was about Venezuela and U.S. imperialism, right? That became way too technical because that talked about it became basically a K because it's like you have to look for the underlying assumptions behind policy issues, right? And that's just K framing at that point. But that's what it turned into. And then we figured out at the beginning of this year that when you have that kind of framework, it just confuses the fuck out of PF judges, right? PF judges are so used to let's how the resolution is fiated, let's figure out what happens afterwards and weigh those impacts, right? So then we realized that if we want to have pre-fiat framework, like it's a lot of PF judges are just going to get confused by it, even if it's like the best framework in the world. So we made framework that is fully unlike, basically it is a utilitarian impact, but it could be weighed under a specific framework. And you'll hear us use this line so often. And it might be like really cringe to a bunch of people, right? But it works for PF. It's like we're an impact magnifier, impact filter under util, right? So in order to solve your utilitarian impact, we need to prefer this. Or we'll go to be like, util is like much lower rank than like in-round education. So it becomes like a theory argument at that point, right? I think this evolved into the fact when we heard people reading our framework, they'd be like, util first. And you get judges like, I don't really know what you're arguing, but I know about utilitarianism, right? So I think when you get into like util versus Dayon debates or util versus whatever you're going to debate, it gets a lot more confusing. And obviously there have been rounds where we did do that debate and we did win off that debate, but it's just much easier, I think, where you just fully be like, the resolution is fiated, you figure out what to do with it. And ultimately in PF, I think your framework is essentially weighing, right? This isn't like LD or policy where your framework is just like huge blocks of text that just filter out arguments, right? It's just a reason to prefer your argument, and it just blocks people out of the argument as well, right? Because neoliberalism is the end goal, like the best impact of the round that we have to stop, right? Whoever can solve that first is most important. And I think once you get the idea of you're thinking of framework as a form of weighing, it's easier to adapt stuff like, for example, the education work from Hill, that's just like a role of the judge that we just straight up took from policy, right? You can adapt that into PF to make it so that people can understand your argument more. Because if I'm going to come up and say like, look, the role of the judge is to be a critical educator, like most judges at PF would be like, what the f is that, right? So you have to go a lot, you have to tone it back, be like, okay, judges know about impact weighing, let's phrase these arguments as a form of weighing, like as like basic framework, so judges can learn to understand it. That sounds really patronized, but can learn to resonate with it more.
Yeah, it's all about putting things in the language of people that are gonna, hopefully vote for you, right?
Yeah.
I think that's been one thing I've learned a lot from this. So thanks so much for coming on here today, Srikar. This is an amazing interview. Great first podcast. I hope everyone watching down below learned a lot. If there are any other debaters or teams that y'all want to hear from, please let us know in the comments. We might be able to get them on a channel. And of course, if there are any top debaters potentially watching this, just hit me or Niche up. Might be able to get you on a video like this. Also, I have to say this, make sure to drop a sub, hit that fat like button if you like the video. It's free and it helps us with the algorithm so more people can see Srikar's beautiful face talking about framework and amazing debate stuff. That's all for now. We'll see y'all the next time when we find another amazing debater to talk with fun stuff about. So adios.